Welcome to FUNC YOU UP, the podcast that gives you the best of functional medicine, nutrition, and wellness in 8 minutes or less.
Hey everyone, welcome to FUNC YOU UP podcast. This is Michelle Miller, clinical nutritionist.
And Samantha Wineke, functional medicine health coach.
Today we are talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. What the funk is gluten?
Oh gosh, what is gluten? So we hear about it all the time. I'm sure you've seen all of those gluten-free options on menus and you're like, what is going on here, right? Why is everyone eating gluten-free?
Yeah, why is suddenly everyone responding to my wedding as gluten-free, including myself?
So this is a protein. Gluten is a protein that we find in wheat, barley, rye, other grains. And it can also be included in a lot of different processed foods. It can be kind of in these mysterious ingredients in foods. And so we know that there are certain people that have celiac disease, right? So
celiac disease is definitely not what I'm talking about in terms of like removing gluten because it might create inflammation. I know we've talked about that in other episodes. But if you're consuming wheat and you have an autoimmune response to gluten, that's where it's a case we're looking into celiac disease, because that's actually creating a real immune response, almost like an allergic response, but an autoimmune response in the body. And celiac disease it affects up to 1 in 100 people. So it is fairly common at this point, although we see way more people than just those with celiac choosing to avoid gluten or at least limiting gluten. And there's a lot of reasons to that, because we know that this little protein in wheat is creating a lot of buzz. So I think a big part of this is not only the fact in our previous episode we talked about how this creates inflammation, but I also just think people feel better when they're not having it. Samantha, I know it's a food you try to limit at times. What do you really notice when you're removing gluten?
So I have noticed that even though I've been able to heal my gut lining to a point where I can tolerate it, when I do have it, I still have some stomach issues the next day and I experience a lot of brain fog. I feel like I can't think clearly, or my thoughts just they don't go all the way. I can't finish my thoughts as much. So I try to stay away from it as much as possible, but I'm very fortunate that I don't have celiac. So it's not something that's life-threatening to me, but I do feel better without it.
So would you say when you consume gluten, you feel like your body's more inflamed in a way?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like my brain's kind of inflamed.
It's amazing. Yeah, there's a book called Brain on Fire. There's a book called Wheat Belly, and they all talk about the different components of why gluten is a factor in creating inflammation in the body. Why one individual, they might notice muscle pain or fatigue versus another might feel more cognitive, brain fog, memory issues finding words. It's a fascinating area. And I think also for those that are celiac, they definitely have to be much more vigilant and serious about removing gluten from all foods, because there can be a lot of hidden sources as well.
Yeah, and I know that it's changed over time, the amount of, or I guess, is it the amount of gluten that's in our bread? Can you drop some gluten knowledge on me?
Absolutely. So we'll throw it all the way back to, first and foremost, I'll hear a lot of patients say, I don't understand why gluten has become an issue. I remember, they talk about it in the Bible, right? So we're talking tens of thousands of years, we have, civilizations that are utilizing bread and wheat and flour. Why was gluten not an issue there? And my personal feeling is that we got to take it back to the 1940s. There was this phenomenal scientist, Dr. Norman Borlaug. He was he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize because his goal was to really end world hunger. And so he spent a lot of time looking into the wheat plant and how we could potentially grow wheat faster and have it be a little bit more resistant to weather conditions. How could we process it faster to get it off of the farm and basically onto our plates and into the stores? And so during this time, he hybridized the wheat product and created something called the semi-dwarf wheat, which is a dominant variety of the wheat that's grown today. And now this has spread to Mexico, it's spread to Pakistan, India, so it's other places in the world. But what a lot of people feel is that during this time of hybridizing the wheat grain, we changed the amount of gluten that's now found in it. And unfortunately, this happened between the 1940s and the 1960s, primarily was when this was all happening. All of that wheat is still the wheat we're consuming today, unless you have some incredibly, VIP source to, ancient grains that it wasn't hybridized. The majority of our grain is hybridized at this point. And I think the concern is that genetically speaking, we have not evolved as a species fast enough to now tolerate this higher content of gluten found in our wheat at this point. So that's one component that I think is a big player of why there's so many people feeling a difference in how gluten affects their body. But I think it's a big one.
Yeah, definitely. And I know that there have been studies that show that so you're talking about the more gluten in these products, and then the more gluten you're consuming, it actually causes your body to release zonulin. And so what that does is you have these tight junctions in your gut, and they're supposed to be really close together as to not allow certain particles into your bloodstream. But that zonulin can sometimes cause those tight junctions to separate and allow some particles to get through, create a little bit more of an immune response. So it's important to note that the change in gluten content in bread over the years.
Yeah, we've definitely seen, an increase in GI conditions as well, especially chronic disease. A lot of this is leading back to gut health. And when we worry about, keeping inflammation levels down in the gut, we're definitely thinking about what is the effect on gluten. And there's even tests that we can do now where we're assessing the gut permeability, which is really like the structure and integrity of the gut lining, also called leaky gut or gut dysbiosis. Mm-hmm. And if zonulin can pass through that barrier, you have what's called a leaky gut, basically, or you don't have a great integrity of that gut lining. And that is often blamed heavily on gluten and how inflammatory that food has been on the GI lining specifically.
Yeah, so you need to be careful too, because gluten can be included in so many foods that you wouldn't expect, right? So it's not just eating bread. You can find it in soups. You can find it in a lot of sauces. I remember one time I had an allergic reaction to a certain concealer I put on because it had gluten inside of it. I didn't even know it could be included in makeups.
I used to use a shampoo that had gluten in it. And I thought, if I'm someone who gets brain fog when I consume gluten, why am I just rubbing this into my scalp, a couple times a week?
Yeah, and it's wild that we have to even look into these things. But it's, it's prevalent in so many things. So
even some medications I have found, and especially with the celiac community, you really, once again, have to be so vigilant about checking labels, calling companies, and making sure you're not getting these hidden sources of gluten. I mean, you will never be able to feel, truly healed and healthy if you're constantly getting these low level supplies of gluten if you're celiac.
Right. And even if you just want to test out how it feels for your body and you're eliminating it for, let's say, like 10 days, it's important to see that, to make sure you're not including those little bits here and there to really try to see if you can reduce that inflammatory response.
For sure. I think too, with gluten-free diets and lifestyles becoming so popular and so prevalent, I do think, again, it is important just to make note of this processed food revolution that's coming out, where there's these kind of like quote unquote healthy foods that are labeled gluten-free, but they're still packaged, they're still processed. Quite frankly, they still could be just as hard on your gut and your gut lining and creating inflammation. So, I mean, that's something that I know Samantha talks to her clients a lot. Like, if it has a barcode on it, if it's in a package, if it's a packaged food item, this can sit on the shelf for weeks at a time. How easy is that food going to be to digest, even though it's labeled gluten-free?
Great point.
So thank you all for joining us today on What the Funk is Gluten. We look forward to future episodes with you. You can follow us on our socials.
You can find us on FUNC YOU UP at Physio Logic NYC. Send us some questions and we'll answer those for you. Or you can follow us on Instagram at Physio Logic NYC.
Talk to you soon.
See you later.
You've been listening to FUNC YOU UP. Be sure to like, review, and subscribe for more daily tips on living well.